In American history, the Gilded Age refers to the extravagant displays of wealth and excess of America's upper class during the post-Civil War and post-Reconstruction era in the late 19th century. The term Gilded Age was coined by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner in their 1873 book, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. The businessmen of the Second Industrial Revolution created industrial towns and cities and contributed to the creation of an ethnically diverse industrial working class, which produced the wealth owned by rising super-rich industrialists and financiers such as John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan. Their critics called them robber barons, referring to their use of overpowering and sometimes unethical financial manipulations. During this time, the labor union movement also began to grow. Long hours and hazardous working conditions led many workers to attempt to form labor unions, despite strong opposition from industrialists and the courts. The period witnessed the creation of the modern industrial economy. A national transportation and communication network was created. The corporation became the dominant form of business organization, and a managerial revolution transformed business operations. The end of the Gilded Age coincided with the Panic of 1893, a deep depression. The depression lasted until 1897 and marked a major political realignment in the election of 1896. President Grant came to the public eye as the lead general in the American Civil War. While a skilled general, Grant was not prepared for the office of the presidency and was often taken advantage of by his appointees. His first vice president, Schuyler Colfax, was involved in the Credit Mobilier scandal, in which members of Congress were bribed to sabotage an investigation of railroad officials. Congress, confident of their power and Grant's lack of experience, voted itself a 50% raise, presuming little would be done to stop their self-appointed raise. The corruption infected all levels of government. In 1875, federal tax collectors were found to be taking bribes from whiskey distilleries to avoid paying federal taxes. Although Grant was not personally involved in these scandals, his presidency was marred by the corruption which continued in local government around the nation. Political machines quickly recognized the importance and power of the immigrant and poor working class vote. To gain support, they offered programs and assistance to these groups to sway and maintain their vote. Once in power, these machines mismanaged public funds, defrauded elections, and made millions in profit from kickbacks. One of the most famous political machines was the Tweed ring scandal in New York City. Tweed became head of the political machine known as Tammany Hall. In one contract alone, city taxpayers paid an additional $10 million to build a courthouse. The extra money went to Tweed and the contractors' personal funds. The national exposure of Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall brought political corruption to national attention. Voters demanded change. In 1883, Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which allowed the president to determine which federal jobs would be filled through civil service exams. National reforms would later follow during the Progressive era. Political corruption, unsanitary living conditions, and the terrible working conditions all plagued the Gilded Age and the American public as the 19th century drew to a close. New social theories that emerged from the Industrial Revolution helped support the ideas of superiority over the poor and minorities. One theory was the adaptation of Charles Darwin's theory on evolution. While Darwin argued that species who evolve and adapt will survive while others will become extinct, many social elite used this to justify the inequities in American society. Social Darwinists argued that the poor were in peril because they were fundamentally unfit and incapable of adapting to the new industrial society. By using this theory, advocates shirked all responsibility and concern for the conditions of the poor, who they believed nature had chosen for extinction. Beyond this was the study of eugenics. This is a field of science that sought to prove that biologically whites were superior to blacks and other minorities. While these theories were based on extreme ideas of biology and exclusion, the segregation and life of African Americans demonstrated the existence of these beliefs in social hierarchy and racial superiority. After 1890, the segregation of blacks and whites was more widespread and became more law than social rule. Segregation was found in all forms of transportation, sports, recreation, hospitals, prisons, schools, and even funeral homes and cemeteries. The legal segregation of races, or Jim Crow laws, dominated public life and set the social rules of white superiority. Voting restrictions established after the Civil War of literacy tests and poll taxes continued to prevent blacks from voting and having a voice in American political life. In 1892, Homer Plessy, 1/8 African American, was arrested for refusing to sit in the colored railroad car. The case made it to the U.S. Supreme Court, challenging the principle of segregation. The claim was that this violated the 14th Amendment, which prohibited the states from denying to any person within its jurisdiction equal protection under the law. In 1898, the Supreme Court ruled that the principle of separate but equal was legal and constitutional. With the federal government now publicly favoring segregation, the practice increased. Many integrated facilities and states began to resegregate and separate blacks and whites once again. Booker T. Washington, like many other leaders of the time, worked to change the system of racial inferiority. Washington was a former slave who worked hard to get out of poverty and rise to national recognition. He believed that in order to gain racial equality, blacks had to educate and train to become productive members of society. By proving themselves as smart, useful, and valuable, they would eventually rise to equality. In 1881, he opened the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama to train black students in vocational skills. When conditions did not approve, more vocal and radical leaders rose. In sharp contrast to Washington, Du Bois was born a free man and was a Harvard graduate. He did not believe that blacks should have to wait for equality, but to demand immediate action. In 1905, he called for a meeting of Washington's opponents to come up with a plan of action. The meeting was held in Niagara Falls, Canada, and became known as the Niagara Movement. The leaders at the meeting released a manifesto against Washington's lenient movement. In it, they stated, "We claim for ourselves every single right that belongs to a free-born American, political, civil, and social. And until we get these rights, we will never cease to protest and assail the ears of America. The battle we wage is not for ourselves alone, but for all true Americans. It is a fight for ideals, lest this, our common fatherland, false to its founding, become in truth the land of the thief and the home of the slave, a byword and a hissing among the nations for its sounding pretensions and pitiful accomplishments." The Niagara Movement influenced and began the NAACP. Founded in 1909, the National Organization of Colored Persons made it their goal to get African Americans the rights guaranteed to them by the Constitution. The graft and corruption of the Gilded Age and the multitude of negative effects of the Industrial Revolution finally led to an era of reform. The Progressive Era was the period from 1900 to about 1920, where community activists and the government worked together to make necessary improvements. The reforms targeted immigrants, workers, voting, and several aspects of American lives, but failed to make gains or improvements for African Americans. Sadly, the rights guaranteed to these Americans would not come until after the 1960s and the Civil Rights era.